The first time anyone heard the old woman whisper the words honey badger, the world tilted just a little bit off its axis. It happened in broad daylight, on a Tuesday morning so ordinary that people barely remembered what they had for breakfast. Gertrude Wren shuffled down the cracked sidewalk in her heavy brown coat, her cane clacking against the cement in that stubborn rhythm everyone in town knew well. She was a fixture of the sleepy place, a bent figure who smelled faintly of lavender soap and stale biscuits, the sort of woman you might help across the street if you were feeling charitable but otherwise forget 5 steps later. That Tuesday morning, however, Gertrude reached into her cloth shopping bag for a tin of tea when a young man burst out of nowhere, a wiry stranger with darting eyes, and yanked the bag from her grip. The crowd at the bus stop gasped, already prepared to see the frail widow collapse helplessly on the pavement. But Gertrude did not collapse. Instead, she leaned forward, almost conspiratorial, and in a voice low enough to make the onlookers lean closer, she whispered honey badger. The mugger froze mid-step, his knuckles whitening around the bag handles. His face drained of color. Then, to the shock of everyone present, he dropped the bag as though it were on fire and sprinted away as if the devil himself were at his heels. For a few moments, silence draped itself over the bus stop. Mrs. Harland, who prided herself on knowing every scrap of gossip in town, actually forgot to breathe. A child tugged his mother's sleeve and asked what a honey badger was, but the mother could only shake her head, wide-eyed. The old woman calmly bent, picked up her bag, dusted it off, and shuffled toward the waiting bus as though nothing remarkable had occurred. The moment was so surreal that by the time the engine coughed to life, everyone doubted their own eyes. Yet none of them could forget the way the mugger had reacted, the way one whisper from a woman who looked like she needed help opening jam jars had sent a grown man fleeing in terror. That afternoon, the whispers about Gertrude's whisper spread like wildfire. In the bakery, in the hardware store, outside the post office, people were asking each other in hushed tones what she could possibly have meant. Some thought honey badger was a password, some secret phrase belonging to a criminal gang. Others swore they had read about the creature, some wild animal vicious enough to scare lions, and laughed nervously at the thought that she might have one hidden in her cottage. A few even claimed she was a witch who had cursed the thief with a single word. Each theory grew stranger, but all agreed on one thing: Gertrude Wren was not so helpless after all. Gertrude, for her part, said nothing. She returned home to her ivy-covered cottage at the edge of town, and brewed herself a cup of tea as though it had been any other day. She hummed softly while she knit a pair of socks, her needles clicking. Yet behind her calm eyes she was alert. She had whispered honey badger for the first time in years, and she knew whispers could carry. She had hoped the name would never again leave her lips, that it could be buried under her rose bushes along with the life she once led. But trouble had a way of finding her, no matter how far she walked from it. The following morning, the gossipers returned to their usual spot by the bus stop. This time, the air was electric with curiosity. They expected Gertrude to shuffle by as always, and they intended to corner her politely, perhaps with feigned concern, to demand the truth. But what they saw instead was Calvin Blackwell's sleek black car purring down the main street. Blackwell had the kind of smile that looked polished in a mirror every morning, all teeth and no warmth. He stepped out in his expensive suit, spreading the word that he was bringing prosperity to the little town. His plan was to buy up the cottages along the edge of the woods, knock them down, and raise a glass and steel shopping center. And right in the middle of his plan sat Gertrude's ivy-covered home. When Blackwell announced he would visit her that afternoon, the townsfolk sighed. They imagined her giving in, packing her tea tins and lace doilies, and moving in with a relative. After all, what chance did an old widow have against a wealthy developer with lawyers and muscle at his side? Yet those who had been at the bus stop yesterday shifted uneasily. They remembered the whisper. They remembered the thief who ran as though chased by ghosts. And though they did not quite believe in magic, they wondered if Blackwell would soon learn something they had glimpsed too. By the time the slick developer walked up her garden path, rehearsing his charming speech, Gertrude was already waiting at the door. Her cane rested against the frame, her posture straighter than anyone expected. She listened politely as he spoke of progress, of community benefits, of generous offers. She nodded as though his words meant little more than the weather report. When he finally stopped, he expected her to plead or bargain. Instead, she smiled the faintest smile and said, "Not today, Mr. Blackwell." His expression faltered. He had dealt with resistance before, but something in her tone made his skin prickle. He opened his mouth to insist, but she leaned forward just slightly. His heart skipped. For the briefest second he was certain she might whisper something. The word honey badger hung unspoken in the air like the promise of thunder. He forced a laugh, muttered about how he would return with paperwork, and hurried back to his car. From behind lace curtains, unseen eyes watched, noting the stiffness of his shoulders as he drove away. The old woman picked up her cane, closed her door, and let out a breath she had been holding since yesterday. She had hoped to live her final years in peace. But with one whispered phrase at a bus stop, the past was stirring. She knew it was only a matter of time before the wrong people heard it. And when they did, peace would no longer be an option. That night, as the town dreamed ordinary dreams, Gertrude sat by her window with a candle and a photograph. The picture showed her much younger, in a uniform no one in the village had ever seen, standing with a team of fierce-looking men and women. Scrawled at the bottom were two words, written in ink that had long since faded but never vanished. Honey Badger. She traced the letters with her finger, her eyes gleaming with memories of missions no one here could imagine. She whispered to herself that it was not yet over. Then she blew out the candle, leaving the cottage in darkness, but her mind alive with the inevitability of what was coming. And so the legend began, not with the roar of an explosion or the clash of armies, but with the faint whisper of an old woman at a bus stop. Those who had seen it would never forget, though none of them yet understood that they had witnessed the reawakening of someone who had once been feared in shadows across the world. The whisper was only the beginning. Morning came with a clean smell after the night rain, and Gertrude woke to the hush that only arrives when everyone else in town is still deciding who they should be for the day. She swung her legs over the side of the bed and felt the familiar ache smooth itself out as if her bones were remembering a rhythm learned long ago. In the kitchen the kettle sang and the first curl of steam drew her into the gentle ceremony she had trusted through the years. She placed 2 cups on the table out of habit, then paused and put one away, a small correction that tightened her throat for a heartbeat. She had promised herself to make peace with quiet, but quiet had a way of pointing at the places where voices used to be. The ivy outside brushed the window and the cottage settled around her like an old coat, comfortable and heavy and lined with old stories. She drank her tea and watched the lane that led down to the town, steady eyes tracking the occasional dog walker or milk van. Nothing unusual showed itself, but the feeling of being observed pressed like a fingertip between her shoulder blades. That whisper had moved through town faster than wind, and wind had a way of squeezing through shutters no matter how carefully they were latched. She finished her tea and moved slowly through the cottage, opening curtains, straightening frames, checking the minute alarms disguised as ordinary life. There was the teapot with a lid that weighed more than it should, the rolling pin that unscrewed at one end to reveal a steel heart, the bookcase with a hollow in the back for a case she no longer touched unless the past breathed too near. None of it looked like anything but cozy clutter to a casual glance. The cottage wore innocence like a shawl, and it had never failed her. Still, she tested the floorboard in the front room with the tip of her cane and listened for the familiar click that echoed up from the tunnel beneath. The sound answered, small and certain, and she let out a breath. The old safe space was ready if it was needed, but she loathed the idea of hiding again. She had not whispered that name yesterday to vanish. She had whispered it to warn. Late morning brought Mabel Harlan trotting up the path with a casserole and a smile that trembled with curiosity. Mabel insisted she had been cooking anyway and cannot eat it all herself, and does not trust her freezer because it makes everything taste of onions. Gertrude accepted the dish with a thank you and tried to close the door, but Mabel had already squeezed inside, praising the doilies and the gleam of the kettle and asking questions that pretended not to be questions. Was she all right after the fright yesterday? Had the police come by? Had anyone strange been seen near here? Had she thought what honey badger might mean? Gertrude fixed a small plate, sat Mabel in the chair with the wobblier leg, and answered each inquiry with soft patience that managed to be both polite and obstruction at once. She could see Mabel's gaze darting beyond her shoulder, hungry for the open door to a room not yet toured. It was the attic that would finally win. Mabel peered up toward the narrow staircase as if trying to see memories hanging from the rafters and declared that the dust up there must be criminal. She rose, casserole still in hand, and made for the steps. Gertrude followed with a speed that made the floorboards nod. The attic was long and dim and smelled of cedar and old wool. Mabel stepped into the center, and immediately caught her toe on the brass corner of a trunk that had not been pushed quite far enough back beneath the slope of the roof. The casserole lurched in Mabel's hands, she yelped, and the lid rattled. It was a ridiculous little calamity that would have ended in spilled gravy and giggles any other day, but this time the impact loosened the trunk's latch. It popped open as if it had been waiting for a cue. Mabel jumped back and then leaned in, eyes wide, because people who make gossip their trade have a talent for recognizing the scent of history. The first thing visible was a photograph, stiff with age. It showed a small team in field gear with a landscape of scrub and scorched earth behind them. The second thing visible was a folder stamped with a word that did not belong in a cottage full of lace and lavender. Gertrude reached past Mabel's shoulder and closed the trunk gently. The air went still, and for a moment Mabel remembered that she had an oven at home that needed attending and that she had left a tap running, though she knew she had not. She stammered that she would come by later for the dish, then hurried down the stairs with a careful smile that said she had seen a ghost, and the ghost had seen her. Gertrude remained in the attic with the closed trunk between her and the past. She had kept the folder out of sentiment, and a little out of spite, because after giving so much to duty it pleased her to keep one thing that duty could not command. She slid the latch once more, opened the lid only a fraction, and let her eyes fall to the words on the folder. Honey Badger Unit. The ink had faded, but the letters still knew how to stand to attention. She touched the edge and a parade of places rose like heat mirages. Hot nights spent on calm breathing with maps spread across a floor. Dawn departures from unmarked airstrips. Quiet jokes traded like currency. Faces that had aged and faces that had not survived long enough to age. She could see herself poised on a ridge with binoculars and a mouth that never trembled, the small figure others overlooked because she looked like she belonged to a market or a church step. People had learned that overlooking her was a mistake. Somewhere down in those files lay evidence that the unit had once cut the tail off a hydra of international cruelty. Somewhere else lay proof that a piece of that hydra had grown back. The next week unfolded like a stretched rubber band, taut and full of quiet expectation. The town did not move as it usually did. People looked over their shoulders more often. They lingered in shops, waiting for someone to mention the old woman's name. Children whispered Honey Badger as if it were a dare, testing whether saying it 3 times in a row might make the lights flicker or summon a beast from under their beds. In the corner booth of the diner, 2 men in ill-fitting suits who had never before been seen in town drank coffee without sugar and never once looked at the waitress in the eye. Their car had tinted windows and the kind of antenna that suggested more than radio signals traveled through it. Everyone noticed, but no one said anything out loud. The whisper had done its work. Gertrude continued her routine as though she had not noticed the shift, but inside she measured every tremor. She went to market and nodded at the butcher, collected her post and smiled at the clerk, watered her roses and hummed a tune that belonged to her girlhood. She looked exactly like the woman she had been for years. Yet behind every step she calculated the angles, counted the doorways, marked the faces that pretended not to watch her. It was a dance she knew too well, the same steps she thought she had abandoned when she closed the folder in the attic. The town believed they were protecting her by looking the other way. What they did not realize was that by staring at her in silence, they were marking her out more clearly to the men who came with Blackwell's money. The first move came at dusk when a pair of Blackwell's hired men stood in the lane blocking her return from the grocer. They were not local. They were built like refrigerators with legs and their jackets bulged at odd angles. One of them smiled the kind of smile that shows no teeth and no humor. They told her she was an old lady with a pretty little home and that progress was knocking whether she liked it or not. They said it would be a shame if she were to trip on her own garden path one night and break more than her hip. Gertrude tilted her head, her cane planted firmly on the cobbles, and for a long pause said nothing at all. Then she stepped close enough that they could smell her lavender soap and whispered the words again. Honey Badger. The sound was not loud, but the silence that followed was thick. The man with the smile twitched as if someone had dropped ice down his collar. The other took a step back, muttered that they had somewhere else to be, and within seconds both were gone, retreating toward their car like men pursued by something unseen. From behind lace curtains and half-closed shutters, townsfolk had been watching. They saw two men twice the size of the old widow stagger away like whipped dogs. They saw her gather her shopping bag and continue up the lane without so much as a glance at their windows. By morning, every household had heard a different version of the story. Some claimed she had pulled a knife from her sleeve. Others swore she had muttered a spell that bent the men's knees. One insisted a shadow had moved in the hedgerow and scared them away. No one agreed on the details, but all agreed on the ending. The honey badger had spoken, and the men had fled. Away. The honey badger had stirred, and the town was beginning to learn what that meant. By the time the leaves along the lane had turned the color of old copper, the town had divided itself without needing a vote. In the bakery line, people rehearsed speeches about progress and prosperity while keeping their eyes on their shoes. Outside the hardware store, others spoke softly of memories that lived in the creak of porch steps and the way the evening smelled after rain. Someone posted hand-drawn flyers that showed a smiling shopping center above a caption about jobs. Someone else wrote the word no across the flyers in neat block letters and then carefully peeled them down because they did not want to fight with neighbors they still waved to in the mornings. The talk came to rest on the same name again and again. Gertrude Wren. She was either going to be a symbol of obstinacy or an emblem of courage, depending on which counter you stood at when you said her name out loud. Blackwell chose a Thursday for his presentation at the town hall because Thursdays sounded reasonable. He arrived with boards that showed glossy renderings of glass glimmering in sunlight that never seemed to fall on the potholes of Main Street. He spoke of economic uplift and convenience and the dignity of a food court. He nodded to a councilman who had begun to believe the reflection of himself in a window display. There were murmurs and a polite smattering of applause. Then the planning chair announced that the cottages by the woods sat on soil with a complicated deed history and would require further survey. That was the moment Blackwell smiled in a way only those who had borrowed money from him would recognize. A different kind of survey would happen in the dark, and it would not involve clipboards. There were new faces in town that weekend wearing the camouflage of bland clothing and bored expressions. They paced routes no local ever needed to pace. They examined the bus timetables as if schedules could talk. One pair ordered tea in the diner and left without drinking it, which a waitress later described as the saddest thing she had seen all month. Another pair stood near the edge of the woods as if tree bark could confess crimes. They were not as invisible as they imagined. Gertrude saw the way they took their pictures with their phones tilted down, the way they kept their right hands free and their left wrists bare, the way they wore ordinary shoes but planted their feet as if they expected the ground to argue. She did not approach them. She simply added 2 pins to the map that lived behind her eyes. The word honey badger drifted through school corridors and back fences and even into the weekly embroidery circle. Youngsters said it like a password and then burst into laughter to prove they were not actually frightened. Someone began to sell little crocheted animals at the Saturday market, and they disappeared from the table in minutes, bought by people who pretended the purchase had nothing to do with the old woman. One clever child made a game of spotting strangers who did not know how to nod like a local and scored points whenever a stranger flinched at the sound of a slammed door. An entire shelf of nature books at the library was suddenly popular as the town tried to decide whether the actual creature could in fact take on a lion. Mabel liked to claim that the creature would not last a minute against her mother-in-law, which briefly united both sides of the debate in laughter. Avery returned 2 days later with a face that looked as if the wind had been unkind. He did not cross the threshold this time, and Gertrude did not offer tea. He spoke in the quiet language of people who have no interest in the dramatic. He had followed a shell company to another shell company and found at the center not a pearl but a grimy marble. The marble rolled wherever a particular cartel pushed it. The network moved weapons disguised as medical equipment, and machines disguised as mining tools. The disused tunnels beneath the edge of town had once been a waypoint in a chain of waypoints the Honey Badger unit had broken years ago. Either accident or design had brought Blackwell to the same ground. Avery had intercepted a fragment of a message that suggested an item would soon require short-term storage against an unplanned delay. He did not need to say what sort of item required darkness, secrecy, and haste. That evening Gertrude asked the teenagers to help her with what she called chores. Danny carried sacks of birdseed to the back and Nora balanced them on a shelf that slid halfway out, and then clicked back with a precision that did not belong to gardening. Jack cleaned the porch step with a brush until the metal head of a nail winked at him in a way that suggested it had a second job. She taught them the habit of noticing. She told them to practice seeing where their feet were in relation to the nearest exit. She turned it into a contest and let them win handily so they would not feel as if they were in a classroom. When Nora asked bluntly whether the men in town were dangerous in a pretend way or in a real way, Gertrude replied that they were real men with pretend smiles. The answer satisfied and unsettled them at once. A man in an orange vest knocked at her door the next morning with a clipboard and a badge that looked so official it might have been printed at a desk in a real office. He announced a safety survey with the humility of someone who has had practice getting past reception. Gertrude stepped aside, and he walked through the rooms with the efficient skin of a person who measured more than square footage. He spent too long near the baseboard in the sitting room. When he finally left, Gertrude waited until the gate clicked behind him, then knelt where he had lingered. Her fingertips found the tiny disk he had tucked into the shadow. She had once used a better version of the same device when tracking a convoy in a mountain pass. She placed the disk in the hollow of a ceramic cat on the mantel. That cat would later take a trip in the Baker delivery van where the device could sing its little song into a different corner of the world. The night the mercenaries came was not marked by storm or thunder or anything grand enough to warn the town. It began with the ordinary hum of insects in the hedgerows and the far-off rumble of a lorry on the highway. Only those who had learned to listen to silence could hear the difference, the careful footsteps placed with intention, the rhythm too cautious to be natural. Gertrude had been awake for hours, not from fear but from habit. She sat in her armchair with her knitting needles clicking softly, the half-finished sock pooling in her lap. When the first shadow crossed the garden gate she laid the needles down as though marking a page in a book, reached for her cane, and stood as if she were simply stretching her back. She knew they would come eventually. Blackwell was a man who mistook patience for weakness and believed money could buy persistence. What he had hired, however, were men who did not know the ground they walked on. The mercenaries moved with the confidence of those who had taken houses apart in places far more dangerous. Their boots pressed softly into soil, their gloved hands carried tools that made no clatter, and their eyes flicked to each dark corner of the yard. The first reached for the porch railing and his knuckle brushed the wrong nail. The step beneath him gave a little groan, and then the board tilted to release a scatter of marbles hidden in a hollow. He slipped, cursed, and grabbed at his partner, sending both into the flower bed. The men hissed at each other in the dark, but the sound carried to Gertrude, who smiled faintly. She did not expect her traps to defeat them. She only expected them to stumble enough to remember they were not in control. She opened her door before they could test the lock. The sudden creak startled them, and their weapons lifted in a reflex they had promised each other they would not need. She stood framed in the doorway, a thin woman in a cardigan, her white hair pinned neatly, her cane steady on the threshold. To anyone else she would have looked like a grandmother woken by a noise. But her eyes did not blink. She invited them in with a nod as if she were expecting company. The mercenaries glanced at one another, uneasy, but training told them not to waste time. They stepped inside and immediately the air felt wrong. The hallway smelled of cinnamon and polish, but beneath that was the faint tang of oil, the kind that belonged to machines rather than kitchens. The first man swept left, the second right. Their lights traced across lace curtains, faded photographs, and bookshelves. Everything looked as a cottage should, until one of them tapped the baseboard and felt a hollow thud. He crouched to pry at it, but a flash of metal stopped him. Gertrude held a knitting needle, its polished point glinting. Her posture was relaxed, but her stance was deliberate. She told him softly that prying into other people's foundations can be very dangerous. They laughed, but not with their eyes, and then moved past her to search further. She let them, because she knew the cottage had a way of leading strangers into its little games. A teapot on the counter rattled when one man brushed it with his elbow. The lid popped off and a thin plume of smoke hissed out, the kind that made eyes sting and throats cough. He swore and stumbled back, blinking rapidly. The other moved to steady him, but his foot caught the edge of a rug that slid in a way rugs should not slide. Beneath it a wooden panel gave way and sent him tumbling into a shallow pit lined with old milk crates. By the time he clambered out, his knees were bruised and his patience thinner than paper. They raised their voices, demanding she tell them where the entrance was, the thing their employer wanted. She tilted her head, pretended not to hear, and asked whether they would like some tea instead. Morning stretched over the town with the bleary relief that follows a sleepless night, and the lane outside Gertrude's cottage filled with the soft clatter of people pretending to take morning walks that just happened to pass her gate. Mabel arrived first, triumphant with 2 casseroles and a pledge that this time the freezer would not touch a single bite. Children hovered in shy clusters, pointing at the porch where a few splinters still clung to the steps as proof that something extraordinary had happened. Danny, Nora, and Jack stood like sentries, bruised and glowing, every inch of them wanting to be told they had done well. Gertrude obliged with the economy of someone who knows praise has more force when measured. You kept your heads, she said, and then added that the town was not saved yet, which drew them closer as if to catch the instructions that would surely follow. She set the kettle on, and the cottage breathed the small domestic breath that comes before a plan. Avery arrived with a face that had slept in a chair and a bag that looked heavier than when he had last carried it through her door. He did not sit until he had placed a folder on the table and slid it toward her with the caution of a man setting down a lit candle in a dry barn. In clipped words he laid out what the scrambled comms and the wandering tracker had given him. The bug the fake inspector had planted had carried a flirtatious signal for a few hours before it woke and began whispering to the wrong home. While it rode the Baker delivery route, it pinged the phones of 2 men with respectable businesses that existed only on paper. Those pings led to an office above a travel agency in the city and to a storage facility booked under a charity name that never collected a single donation. There, a crate had been logged as medical equipment with a weight that did not match the model number. The crate was due at the edge of town within days. The tunnels were not just useful. They were essential to a route that prided itself on vanishing. The teenagers listened with dawning horror, and a strange pride as if realizing they had wandered onto a stage and found their marks by instinct. Avery broke the moment by tapping the folder and saying that evidence is a patient animal, but occasionally it appreciates a little chase. The council had scheduled an emergency session to reconsider the permits after the public scuffle. Blackwell would come to smooth ruffled feathers and to recover the appearance of control. The plan, Avery said, was to make him bring his shadow with him. A public meeting was an inconvenience to him, but he could not risk losing momentum. If they seated the room with the right questions and presented the right paper at the right time, he would have to either back away from his project or double down and reveal more than he intended. Gertrude listened, fingers folded around the warm teacup, then nodded once. She would bring the town's courage. Avery would bring the law's attention. Between them, Blackwell would bring his own downfall. In the hours before the meeting, the town shifted from whispers to small acts. Mr. Pierce the clerk changed his tie 3 times and finally chose the one his grandmother had given him with the tidy thought that bravery sometimes needs a talisman. Mabel rehearsed a speech in front of her pantry shelves and made herself cut the 3 most dramatic sentences because they were for her and not for the cause. Danny, Nora, and Jack canvassed the schoolyard, warning their more reckless friends not to take bets about storming the hall and to save their lungs for cheering at the right moment. Gertrude put on her coat and slipped the transmitter into its old pocket, not because she expected to need it, but because ritual steadies more than hands. As she stepped out, She glanced at the garden stones and saw that a neighbor had nudged one slightly off its mark when delivering kindness. She smiled and left it skewed on purpose, a small pledge that the house could rest without needing every old trap set. The council chambers filled with bodies and heat until the walls felt as if they leaned in to listen. Blackwell entered with the easy confidence of a man used to reprogramming rooms by stepping into them. He began with apologies for any distress and a recital of benefits that made the project sound like rain in a drought. Pierce cleared his throat and asked for clarification on the companies responsible for site preparation. The question was simple in tone and devastating in implication. Gertrude stood to ask whether the developer had performed a subsurface impact assessment, her voice calm as a plumb line. Mabel followed with an inquiry about noise, slipping in a specific reference to the hour the crate was due to arrive at the storage facility. That number hung in the air like a bell. Blackwell laughed in the wrong octave. He waved new paperwork that he claimed would settle all concerns, but the paper did not rustle with the clean arrogance of fresh lies. It shook in his hand. Avery, who had been a quiet figure at the back, stepped forward when the chair recognized outside expertise. He introduced himself in the most boring terms he could manage, and then gently laid out a map of the shell companies tied by shared accountants and unusual insurance policies. He never used the word cartel, but the room heard it anyway. Then he asked for permission to submit supplemental exhibits, and two officers who had been pretending to be maintenance crew lifted a box onto the table. Inside were printouts from the tracker pings and a chain of custody for a recovered device that had more corners to its history than a chessboard. Blackwell's face went still. He glanced at the side door with the quick calculation of a man measuring distance, and the odds of a clean exit.